ranking the top 20 wide receivers in the NFL. Super excited for the series. I'm going to go through every position and every player in the NFL and rank them. I'm going to have it separated into a few videos, just the top 20. Obviously, I want to keep these a lot shorter, and I know a lot of more people are interested in these, but I'm going to go through all the receivers afterwards. Don't worry. But, going through the top 20 wide receivers. Now, with this is how good these players are. This isn't fantasy rankings. This isn't long-term, who would I rather take in like a draft right now? This is for the 2021 NFL season. Who helps your team win the most? And the one thing that maybe is a little controversial compared to that stuff is I'm not including injuries. This is if you're on the field. Now, that's basically because injuries are so hard to predict, especially in the NFL. And frankly, I'm concerned with what you like on the field. The rest of that stuff is important, obviously, but I think it makes things less interesting. So, let's get into this. So first thing, the first 5 out, these players are close to the top 20. And don't worry, I know there's some ones here that people are probably already perking their ears up about. I'm going to get into these a lot more when I go through the full video with all of them. But for this one, I'm not going to talk about them too much. Just these guys are really good, but for various reasons, whether it's injuries, in terms of, I know I just talked about injuries not mattering, in terms of not being on the field for a full allotment of snaps, to prove how good I think they are / limitations in certain areas of the field. That's why these guys are right on the outside. But for the top 20, the colors, by the way, tiers. So right at the end here, and those last 5 guys would all be in the same tier with Adam Thielen here. But number 20, Adam Thielen. One thing to keep in mind with these top 20 receivers is that all these guys are really, really good and help your team win a lot. And that's something that is important to keep in mind when I talk about the differences in these guys. When I'm talking about criticisms, it's not in terms of like they suck compared to everyone. It's just compared to the guys that are around, they struggle with this. So Adam Thielen at 20, what gets him into the top 20? Well, basically something you're going to notice as a theme here generally is getting open is just so obviously the most important skill for a wide receiver. There are other things that matter. Being able to catch the ball, obviously, run after the catch, as will crop up with some players, is really important too. But the main thing is how often you get open. And that's why Adam Thielen's on this list, because he's open a lot. Now, he has a lot of other things going for him. He has really good ball skills, especially in the intermediate area. He tracks the ball really well, and he can separate against, press coverage, all that stuff. He's good. But what keeps him down here as compared to the other guys is he's not great after the catch, certainly, especially at this point in his career. He does lack top-end speed, that type of thing. But in terms of a guy who's going to drive your offense, he's way up there. He's really good. So then we have a tier break here. And you're getting into some young guys here who are definitely on their way up. And while I do think they're all clearly behind the guys in front of them, and when I do this list, next year, the year after, obviously these guys are going to be way higher. But so for this, Deebo Samuel, Terry McLaurin, Justin Jefferson, all fairly similar in terms of the value to a team, but much different in the way they go about it. Deebo Samuel, a player who is a absolute monster after the catch, maybe the second best in the league compared to somebody I'm going to talk about later. Incredibly good. And frankly, as a receiver, he's probably underrated. People talk about him because he does benefit from playing in the 49ers offense, the Shanahan offense, as a player who is dependent on that type of thing. But the difference between him and a player like DJ Moore that was not in this top 20 list is when you see him isolated on routes, which does still happen in the 49ers offense fairly consistently. I mean, it's an NFL football team. He's still really good. He gets open a lot. Now, one major thing keeping him down here below these other guys is his hands are a disaster at times. He drops more open passes than any other receivers anywhere close to this top 20, but he really makes up for it in other ways. You're talking about a player who, again, provides a ton of value, especially over the middle of the field as a run after the catch player, and again, actually separates. Really good. Terry McLaurin, he basically does everything that Deebo Samuel does minus the drops. Now, he's not the same after the catch, certainly, but the other things he does, I think, makes up for that, catching the ball being one. And actually, as terms of a separating receiver, especially in the intermediate range, he's better for sure. He's not crazy elite at it compared to the guys at the very top of this list, but definitely good, and a player who's going to continue to get better, and frankly is already a guy who's a super positive on offense. And frankly, Justin Jefferson's borderline the same player. They look a little bit different. Justin Jefferson definitely not as fast, but better in terms of being open, which again is clearly the most valuable skill. And And yeah, Justin Jefferson's a player who's borderline dominant already. If he's on your offense as a receiver one, your offense is going to have a baseline of production because he's going to be open consistently, very consistently. And there's a reason that he's already in the top 20 of this list. The guy's really good. Next, we have a tier break, and we're going to get into a pretty big one here, which actually I'm going to go ahead and skip to the next slide so you can see all the guys in this tier. And these are all players who, again, are really good, but compared to the guys in the top 10, do have pretty notable flaws / things that keep them from being these all-around high-end receivers. Now, again, all these guys, huge positives on your offense, but what's the difference between these guys? So, 16, Odell Beckham Jr. The reason he's at the bottom of this list is, frankly, injuries have clearly sapped him of the super explosiveness, agility he had from the first couple of years of his career. This being different, an injury situation that I talked about earlier, different than like Will Fuller or something where it's like current concern in terms of being on the field. I'm not necessarily so much worried about that with Odell. It's more of what injuries in his past have taken away from him. And I think that's a big thing. Now, he's still a player who's very, very constantly open, especially in the intermediate deep areas. He consistently wins down the field in really good ways. He knows how to sit in zone coverage. He knows how to track the ball, all that type of stuff. Now, some flaws with him. He actually, especially I think the main place you see the decline in his skill is his ability to release against press coverage. Now, that's not a super valuable skill. People talk about that as something really valuable with prospects going to the NFL, obviously relevant with the NFL draft just happening. I mostly pretty clearly disagree. Press coverage in the term of like, in the sense of like one-on-one guy right at the line of scrimmage rarely happens, honestly, in this modern NFL, outside of a few defense, if you're playing the Seahawks or something like that, they do it for sure, but most teams don't. And it's actually going to influence which of these receivers get higher or lower because that skill not quite as valuable as it used to be in the last like 5-6 years where the Seattle cover three's kind of fallen out of favor a little bit. But Odell, that's the one major concern at this point. He's still pretty good at it compared to a lot of guys in the NFL, just not compared to these guys at the top. So then you got Mike Evans. Now, Mike Evans is a really interesting one because there are people I think who are going to think Mike Evans belongs way higher, and some people who maybe hate him a little bit too much and think he's lower. So he is a player, and this is kind of similar to some other guys in this year, notably DK Metcalf and Chris Godwin, who struggle with – well, struggle is a strong word, but aren't really elite in terms of the actual receiver skills, the things I'm talking about being really valuable, the separation, that type of thing. But they have one or two certain areas that are so, so good that it makes up for it. And Mike Evans has that in the way that he kills press coverage. And I know I just talked about that in negative light, but it still does happen, and nobody in the NFL, literally nobody outside of the top like 3 guys, kills the way Mike Evans does. I mean, if you throw big physical corners who aren't Jalen Ramsey at him, they just have no chance. That's how you get things like him going for 250 yards some games and 0 the next, because he's a really matchup dependent weapon who kills that type of thing. But versus zone coverage versus guys who are going to play off of him, not as good. Now he's still useful, certainly, and actually he's similar in a lot of ways to DeAndre Hopkins, a player we're going to talk about later, in terms of consistently being open about 15 yards and dig route, curl route, that type of thing. But what keeps him lower here is his slight inability to consistently win against off corners or zone coverage, and frankly, as a contested catch guy, he's just not that good. Now, that's probably going to be controversial. Some people just watch highlights, that type of thing. And because he's, 6'6", and I get that. But something about contesting catching is, one, I'm going to go into this now. I just don't think it's that valuable of a skill. Not because it's not useful. It obviously is. That provides a lot of benefit to the NFL. It's just the difference between the high-end guys and the middle tier in that specific skill is just very small. Like the best guys, whatever, they win those 55% of the time, and the worst guys win or the middle tier wins 52%. Like it's not a large difference as opposed to separation guys where a player like Stephon Diggs or somebody who's open 9 out of 10 out of 10 times versus a middle tier receiver is open 5 out of 10 times. That's a way, way, way bigger difference, and you see that clearly with what receivers actually provide production in the NFL. And that goes back around to my problem with Mike Evans, like I said, that even if he theoretically was as good as people think he is at that scale, he still wouldn't be that high. But just something to know, when you watch him, really, if you watch all his snaps, he is fairly weak at the catch point, to be honest with you. Now, there's certain situations, when he has his back turned, he's going over the shoulder, that type of thing he's good at. But he shares a flaw with Julio Jones, who's a player later that, despite being huge, they're actually just not that strong with their hands, which is more of an interesting thing. Mike Evans is definitely better than Julio in that specific facet, but more of an interesting thing anyway. Probably spent too much time on him, but yeah, that's Mike Evans. DK Metcalf, maybe a little controversial to have him ahead of Mike Evans. I'm pretty comfortable with that. DK Metcalf does basically everything Mike Evans does, but he's actually good at contested catches, and that's really the only difference. He's also better after the catch, not by a gigantic amount, but really similar players at this point. DK Metcalf just, I think, better at the things that Mike Evans not so good at. Although I will note, the thing I was talking about with press coverage, that actually gets flipped here. DK Metcalf still learning how to deal with that, does not kill it nearly the way that Mike Evans does. And if there's an argument for those to switch those guys, I think maybe anywhere in this list, if I was going to switch two players to be here, it's that. But I do value DK Metcalf's ability after the catch, I think, more than that specific skill. So that's those two. Then you got Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley is really good. As in terms of a guy who's going to beat anyone of any type in man coverage, he's way up at the top. He constantly, and not just beats people, I mean, he kills people. He creates gigantic amounts of separation on a, borderline play-to-play basis, which is about as good as it gets. Now, the difference between him and a player who's way up at the top of this list, who also does that, is Calvin Ridley struggles in a lot of the other areas, and pretty notably. So him and Chris Godwin actually next are both similar in terms of that one specific skill they're really good at. The rest of it, not so much. Calvin Ridley is creating gigantic amounts of separation versus zone coverage. But the problems with him, not strong at the catch point at all. Really not notable, even arguably bad in terms of a playmaker after the catch, which are skills that matter. While I said, he's this high because that first thing he does is so good. But the rest of that stuff does bring him down here. Next, Chris Godwin. Same thing, but instead of separation being his primary, number one talking point, it's his after this catch skill. I think he's very likely, in terms of receivers, the best in the NFL. I don't even think it's really that close, which is what gets him this high. Because, frankly, compared to every other receiver in this top 20, he's not the skilled player that those guys are. He isn't really a separation creator by himself. He benefited a ton. I mean, they talk about, Bruce Arians and the slot receiver, and people kind of mean that a little bit, but that is very clearly true with him. Now, he's not bad, but he's pretty straight average at those type of things. He's not going to consistently win down the field against good corners, any type of that thing, but he's not a disaster there, and he's just so unbelievably good as a guy, as a runner with the ball in his hands, that, again, it pulls him way up here. Because when you're talking about how modern NFL offenses work, it's so easy to get guys like him the ball, 10, 15 times a game and let him do what he does, that he's still super valuable. And that's something that I talked about at the beginning that, again, remember with this, it's not about who's the best necessarily. It's about who helps you win a game in the NFL in 2021 the most. And that's why Chris Godwin's this high. Next, Keenan Allen. So Keenan Allen is a really interesting case, because when I started doing this list, he wasn't even close to this tier necessarily. But when I was looking more and more at it, thinking about what matters at receiver, he does those things really well, and not just consistently, but constantly. When I talk about generally guys, I'll generalize them into how many times or how many plays are they going to get open out of 10, right? And Keenan Allen is borderline 10 out of 10. Now, he's not, the difference with him and the top 10 guys is that he's not going to get super, super open. He doesn't break ankles the way that Stephon Diggs does or Robert Woods does. But he does create, it's not nothing. It's better than all the rest of the guys that I've talked about so far. And after the catch, while he's good, he does struggle with long speed and that type of thing. And that bleeds into his ability as a deep receiver for sure. And that's the problem with him. But in terms of, again, because that type of stuff you can kind of paper over. And if you have that first part, that first 60, 70% of a receiver who's going to be open all the time underneath, it's just so incredibly valuable that I ended up kind of realizing that if you're taking a receiver to win you a game or help you win a game here, you should be taking the guy who's just always open. And that's why Keenan Allen gets this high, despite having some physical limitations compared to the rest of the guys and that type of thing. Although I will mention, too, again, despite his physical limitations, as far as the contested catch guy goes, despite being smaller, he's kind of just as good as a Mike Evans or Odell Beckham at this point. So kind of an interesting note there. So next we get into the first tier break in a while here. And these next two players, I think, name recognition wise or general thinking wise are going to be way higher than a lot of people, but there are pretty clear reasons that I have them this high. And them being Allen Robinson at 10 does everything that I just talked about with Keenan Allen in terms of very consistently being open, short to intermediate. He does all that, and he also adds the ability to win downfield, to win contested catches, to run after the catch a little bit. He's basically, which is a weird thing to think about, because there's size difference, that type of thing. But he's basically just a bigger, better Keenan Allen, which equals a really good receiver, really, really good receiver. And Robert Woods, way different player, but he fits right into that type of mold that I've been talking about in terms of a Calvin Ridley or Justin Jefferson, whatever, who get open all the time, but he also does everything else really well. And that's going to be a common theme with all these top 10 receivers is they effectively do everything really well. And there's going to be pretty little minuscule differences between them. They are there, but yeah, with Robert Woods, I mean, you're talking about a player who's open, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 times, is really good after the catch, really underrated there. I don't think people necessarily realize how good he is at that. He consistently breaks tackles and creates yards, knows what he's doing, has vision down the field. Really good. He also, not that this necessarily matters, probably the best run blocker on this list so far. But yeah, he's really good. And of all the guys we've talked about so far, he wins the quickest, which is a super valuable skill in the modern NFL. If you can beat a guy in a slant in one step and a go, in an explosion one direction, you're borderline unguardable at that point. And Robert Woods has that. Now he's getting older. We'll see how long that lasts. But as of now, Robert Woods still super good, super underrated still. There's a reason he consistently performs really well with a bad quarterback. And don't sleep on Robert Woods, please. He's incredibly good. So then we have the next tier, starting with Amari Cooper. Why Amari Cooper is this high is because he is the only one, even above Calvin Ridley or Keenan Allen or Robert Woods, the only one who can even consider himself in the same class of just winning on routes as the top two guys that we're going to talk about in this list. The top three guys. No one else comes close to him. Amari Cooper, you could argue, should be higher. Obviously, there are reasons that he's not, given his what people are going to call inconsistencies, which I would say is more just his lack of great ability way down the field and his after the catch being more league average as opposed to elite. But he's a player, yeah. He wins explosively, quickly, and borderline constantly, which is super, super valuable. And in a better offense, which, well, you're going to see that this year for sure. But, I mean, you saw it a lot of the time last year, too. If he was in a different situation through a lot of his career, people would think of him as good as he actually is. Fantasy owners, I can see especially, would argue with him being this high. But you're talking about talent. You're talking about a guy who is likely to win you any given football game. He clearly belongs this high on this list. Next. So excited to talk about A.J. Brown. Holy shit, he's so good. A.J. Brown, not quite the separator, really close compared to Amari Cooper, Robert Woods, or whatever, but he is the only guy who probably rivals Chris Godwin as an after-the-catch player. He does win very consistently down the field, despite his size and presumed lack of agility. He beats all different types of corners consistently. He still has a little bit of struggles with the type of off corner, like a Jair Alexander, that type of thing, like a little bit, but the difference with him compared to other guys who struggle with that is the second he catches it, and there's the common sense thing with him being as big as he is, he gone, as opposed to those other guys who still a valuable 20-yard catch, but with him it's just a touchdown. It's shocking what he turns into touchdowns, and combine that with how good he is at everything else, and he's really good, including down the field. He's a borderline elite guy too. I mean, A.J. Brown is super elite receiver, really good. Deandre Hopkins. If anything people are going to get mad about, it's probably this one. But I'm very comfortable with this. He's not – well, here. I'm going to talk about what he can do as opposed to what he can't do first. DeAndre Hopkins, right? You're talking about a player who in that, out of 10 thing I keep talking about is probably going to get open 7 out of 10 times. And he's going to get open in pretty valuable areas in terms of the 10 to 18, 20 yard. Like nobody wins dig routes the way that DeAndre Hopkins does. But he is not a quick separator almost ever unless it's schemed into a play. Now, he still can do it, and he has really, really good body control, incredible body control. And he can win slants with that, but the difference is when you win them like that, as opposed to the way that like an Odell Beckham does or a Robert Woods does, it limits the upside of any given catch to, whatever, 10 yards as opposed to a touchdown, which over the course of a season, 140 targets, which is the type of range we're talking about with all the receivers at this point, that does really make a difference. Now, he's still really good, obviously, and as far as the contested catch guy go, he's way up at the top. Maybe even the best, but like I talked about, I don't, that skill is just not as valuable as I think a lot of people think it is. Not really. There's a pretty good reason that he's not as good as any of the top 5 here. Now, there are arguments for it. I get that. And production-wise, he's going to be in the top 5. But as an actual player, if you're trying to win an NFL game, all the guys in front of him are going to offer something that he doesn't, or offer all the things he does, but better. And that's kind of my thing with DeAndre Hopkins now. He's number 6 in the entire NFL, so he's still really, really good. Don't get me wrong. And he's a very gigantic positive if you have him on your team, all that stuff. But he is just not as good as the top 5. So, if I was honest, top 5, here we go. Why is he above everyone else? Mainly, he has one of those skills that no one else can match him in, but it's in a more valuable area. So I talked about that with Keenan Allen or with Chris Godwin, Calvin Ridley. Michael Thomas has that, but it is kind of the meme, but there's a reason for it. And it's winning within 10 yards. He does it literally every time. It is impossible for a single corner to cover him effectively ever within 10 yards. Now, he has other limitations that guys like even DeAndre Hopkins, A.J. Brown don't, for sure, the down the field stuff. But frankly, he's better at that than people give him credit for. He's not bad at it. And he was clearly limited, all the talk with the Drew Brees offense. He was clearly limited by that, which makes sense. It's hard. You shouldn't blame him for that, really. But yeah, Michael Thomas, incredibly good, constantly going to win in that area, which is going to lead to your offense being really good. We saw that with the Saints for forever, and Michael Thomas played a huge part in that. As far as after the catch guy, he is lacking a little bit, but he's still good at all that stuff. So, yeah, Michael Thomas really good, but he has been a tier by himself because I don't think he's quite the player that the next 4 are for sure. So, now the top 4. Here we go. Julio Jones. Julio Jones is aging, and he is injured a lot. But when he is on the field, he is still dominant every time. Nobody, I think maybe what people forget about him most is just how goddamn fast he is for someone his size, because he doesn't look like he's moving that fast. That's a huge part of success, because if you're running, an over route, a 10, 15, 20 yard over route, he's going to be open every single time without fail. And he can turn that stuff into touchdowns all the time. Now, in terms of highlight reel wise, is he good at really contested catches? I would argue no. Actually, he's pretty bad at it. There's a reason he struggles in the red zone a lot, and it's more his fault than people. I think people blame it on Matt Ryan, who isn't good there either. But a lot of that is Julio Jones' fault. But regardless, he's so good at all the other stuff. He separates all the time down the field. He's in the same class as like DeAndre Hopkins and like dig routes, that type of thing. He's really, really good at that. After the catch, he's actually really good. It doesn't look, again, highlight worthy because he's not juking out people like crazy or that type of thing, but really good at it. And as a receiver, if he is on the field, for whatever, all your offensive snaps, you're talking about a player who's going to result in huge offensive production no matter what, even if your offense is idiotic like the Falcons has been since Kyle Shanahan left. So, yeah, Julio Jones clearly still top 5. His age, whatever. He'll get to a point where he's not, but it's not right now. Number 3, Stephon Diggs. It's not recency bias. I thought this going into the year. I wish I had my YouTube channel. I would have been spouting all about that after the Vikings traded him. Stephon Diggs is a dominant player in every aspect of the game that an NFL receiver can be dominant at. The end, there's not a ton to talk about. I didn't give him nearly enough credit when he was on the Vikings because of the offense that he played in and him being next to Adam Thielen, that type of thing. But he showed very clearly this year he was the reason for the Bills' success. Yes, Josh Allen did get better. Yes, they did have an overall good team. I like their head coach, all that stuff. But there's the difference between the Bills' last couple of years, Josh Allen the last couple of years, and now was Stephon Diggs. And I have zero problem stating that as a fact because it is. Stephon Diggs is a player who's open 10 out of 10 times, and not just open. He is open by miles. He is really good after the catch. He is really good down the field. He can track the ball borderline perfect. He's of all the guys we talked about contested catches outside of maybe A.J. Brown and I don't know, DeAndre Hopkins. He's the next one for sure. I mean, he's dominant at everything an NFL receiver can be dominant at, just because he's not 6'5", 220, and whatever, looks like a traditional number one receiver, that type of thing. That's the only reason you could possibly not put him at number one. And hey, turns out that shit does not matter. It only matters what you do on the field. Stephon Diggs, very clearly number 3. I could easily argue him at number 2, but Stephon Diggs, yeah, he's all that. He will continue to be all that, no problem. Number 2, Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill does all the things Stephon Diggs does, but he's also the fastest player in the NFL. This is in terms of good, and I talked about this earlier. I would argue Stephon Diggs, Julio, a lot of these guys in the last 3 or 4 are better than him technically, but okay. I mean, Tyreek Hill is still borderline elite at all that stuff, and his speed is just such a dominant factor that, I mean, everyone sees it. It's very obvious. I don't need to talk about that at length, but that's such an incredibly valuable thing that changes the way defense have to play the Chiefs, changes what defense even can do against the Chiefs, and allows Tyreek Hill to be a dominant player anytime he's on the field. Definitely number 2 here. Again, because he's still good at all the other stuff. Now, if he was just a speed guy, we're going to get into that when I do the full list of all the receivers. We're going to get into guys who are not as fast as Tyreek Hill, but fairly close, who are way lower, because if you don't have all the stuff to combine with that speed, it turns out you actually aren't all that good. But if you do, like Tyreek Hill does, you're here. And then number 1, clearing away number 1, different tier by himself, Damonte Adams. He just wins games. Aaron Rodgers is really good. Obviously, he's incredible. But Damonte Adams is never not open. Again, it's splitting hairs at the top here, but he's Stephon Diggs plus the size. He's Tyreek Hill minus the speed, but everything else turned up. He's everything, again, you want in a wide receiver. He's dominant at everything you can be. Only thing is his speed is he's not super fast, but he's so good down the field. Probably better than everyone else we've talked about outside of Tyreek Hill. That it just doesn't matter. You're talking about a player who's going to win you football games when he's on the field. And, the Packers have been real lucky to have him, and it's shocking because he was not obviously nearly this level for the first however long in his career. But, dominant player, the most dominant receiver in the NFL. And again, different tier by himself, no question. So, that's the top 20. You see them all here. I'm going to do a full list of all the receivers afterwards. But this, I'm really comfortable with the ordering here. Maybe a little things you can argue with, but these are the 20 best wide receivers in the NFL.